All right, Wilfred. Well, first, wanted to say thanks again for doing this. It's wonderful to meet you. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. So, welcome to the show. It's good to have you on.
Good to be here.
Thanks, man. I wanted to start with I know you're very active on Twitter and you have a large Twitter following, and I did a bunch of research for related to your work. But I wanted to quote your tagline on your Twitter handle, which is "A college professor now. I'm a former corporate executive, freedom rider, law student, and poor kid." There's a lot online related to your work, but not a lot that I was able to find related to your background and your personal life. And I would love to give the listeners an opportunity to hear about who you are and where you came from. I'm sure that is a very long story, but what is your background? Where did you grow up, and what is the journey that brought you to what you're doing now, which is a college professor?
Well, I had a pretty atypical background for kind of an upper middle class academic, which I think is an advantage, actually. When I read Thomas Sowell's writing, it's sort of a similar experience. Like, he was born in a working class Black neighborhood and went into the Army, finally went to college, but originally an HBCU, and then went to Harvard for a while, as I recall, University of Chicago. And started writing, started teaching, and all this, working to support himself as a grad student. So this went on for, a period of decades. My background is somewhat similar. So I grew up in the hood, basically. Like, my mom, I myself wasn't extraordinarily poor, interestingly enough. So I got to see kind of both sides. We didn't have any money. That's part of the tagline. But my mom was an inner city teacher for a lot of her life. She taught in what is District 31, which is East Aurora, just outside of Chicago. I was originally born on the south side of Chicago and moved from there to kind of the pre-gentrification sort of middle north side of the city. So I lived in Wicker Park for a while, and for, academic and athletic reasons, moved just outside the city to this other sort of working class community, the east side of Aurora, where my mom was then teaching. So growing up, it was kind of just ordinary working class life experience. Aurora in the 1990s was the murder capital of the Midwest pretty consistently for a period of 2 or 3 years, because mostly African-American gangs from Chicago were coming out into the region and clashing with sort of the native, Hispanic and Caucasian gangs. And a bunch of people were getting shot. So that was part of the background for my experience. And I didn't gangbang. I was an athlete to some extent. I'm 5'9", so it wasn't all that incredible. And was just in general a student. Obviously my mom taught in the school district, so it was fairly hard for me to completely slack off in class. And as a result of that, I ended up getting more college opportunities than I'd expected. My honest expectation after high school was that I would go into the military. And a working class high school in the Midwest obviously sends a lot of people through kind of that conduit path to, the Army, Navy, so on. So our high school, East Aurora Senior, had this giant ROTC armory on the campus, and you'd see people, outside running around and doing calisthenics and so on. The military recruiters, who were perfectly nice, normal guys, would be sort of out on the track when I was working out. My spring sport was varsity track. And there was always that element of like, hey, if you don't make it to college doing this, Uncle Sam's waiting for you. So, that was something I thought was pretty likely. But in fact, and I now understand the power dynamics involved. I was a Black kid. I was from a poorer area. I did well on standardized tests. My SAT wasn't off the charts, but it was something like 1360. So I now realize that obviously I was going to go down that next step, but that's what ended up happening. And I could go into a little more detail about the background in Chicago, which was an interesting, sort of city kid experience. I lived in the city itself till I was around 12. And this is that one movie Kids era, the 80s and early 90s, before they really started cleaning up Chicago and New York. So, you would definitely, going to school, get on the trains and see people painting graffiti and so on. And, Wicker Park was still poor at the time, but was already the arts district for the city. So you'd see purple-haired skateboarders walking by, homeless guys going the other direction and so on. But as I got through that entire phase, I went on to college. Essentially, I went to Southern Illinois University, which at the time was kind of a chill intro to college. It was a relaxed sort of party school environment. The school at that time was embarrassing its administrators by consistently making Playboy's list of the top 20, engagement sort of party social schools in the country. So it was definitely solid academically as well, but you got to kind of work your way up into the college experience. I was a pretty bad student early on. I was smart, but I hadn't really gotten used to the idea of doing a lot of work or paying a lot of attention in school. And in high school, I used to do all of my homework just in my easier classes and then go kind of do whatever I wanted. But gradually got into the academic experience a bit more. And when I graduated, I was 20.
Yep.
I'd always been kind of younger. I was socially promoted, or whatever the term is, up through one grade. I think it was third grade, because they didn't really think they had much of anything to teach me in the Chicago or the Aurora public school system at that time. So when I got out of college, I also got out of college in 3 years. This is something I'd recommend that people do, by the way. Strategically understand kind of the college process. So don't go in not sure of your major and just take a bunch of classes at the cost you'd be paying at a 4-year school. I mean, there's a lot to be said for doing your first 2 years at a community college and then transferring. So you're going to go in with a really high GPA and you're going to pay maybe $2,400 for that whole experience. There's a fair amount to be said, frankly, for joining the military than going to college for free. Yeah, with 4 or 5 years of that just covered. But there's also something to be said, I think, for what I did, which was taking while I was on scholarship. I got a scholarship there, but taking 18 hours every semester and focusing more on your major and on getting out than on getting secondary credentials and so on. But anyway, I went into college at 17. I guess I had turned 17 just before going. I got out in 3 years or a little over, so I was 20 years old, and I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. So I had sent out a couple of grad school applications. I remember sitting around my, apartment near campus with my girlfriend, Lisa A at the time, and, sending these in the mail. I don't get a good job. Maybe I'll become some kind of professional. And actually I got into law school. The interesting thing about law school is that it's almost totally random. Like affirmative action plays a role, legacy admissions play a role, but there are a huge number of reasonably qualified, ambitious applicants for every school. Yeah. So I applied to 15 schools. That was the majority of my grad school applications. I got into 2. I got into the University of Illinois, which at the time was 15th in the country, and the University of Dayton, which was not. I was also waitlisted at Yale, kind of at random. So, maybe I would have gone on and done something completely different, or worked for Bain and become one of those jackasses. Had I gotten into Yale law and just stayed on that track. But I went to U of I. And again, when I got out of there, I was 22, maybe 23. So the thing that I had focused on, to the extent you train for anything in law school, was white-collar criminal prosecution. I mean, I'd taken Crim Law, Crim Pro 2. I'd taken, if I recall correctly, the white-collar class. And I mean, I think I would have been solid enough in that field. My interest at the time, and I actually was pretty radical in class terms for a while. To some extent, I still am. But this is around the time, if you're talking about 2002 to 2005, of Enron. I mean, a lot of these other, Health South, these major corporate scandals. And I thought it would be interesting to try putting some of those guys in jail. And as I saw it at the time, competing with them, frankly, as versus locking up kids for, possession of a dime bag of weed or something like that. Yeah. But again, your first job as a lawyer, this is true in prosecutors' offices, definitely. It would have been even more true if I'd gone into big firm civil law, but is often pretty miserable. One of the guys that I graduated from law school with, who told me a story where he applied at Jenner and Block, which is a large Chicago law firm. And as he was walking through the office, he spotted a cot on the floor, by one of the desks. And he just raised his hand politely and asked, Mr. Junior Partner, why are there bids in the office? And the guy said something along the lines of, well, sometimes one of our very young associates, which is what you guys are going to be, just decides they really want to go hard and put in a few extra hours. Yeah. And then he shoved the thing back under the desk so no one could see it. The trip went on. But looking at that kind of thing, I did send out some apps, but I applied to 1 or 2 grad schools. This time I was taking it a lot less seriously. But I got into Southern Illinois, which is where I'd gone to college, and went back there for grad school. Now, the story would be pretty mundane, kid grew up in working class area, got into okay grad school, went on to teach. But that ended up being a lot more complicated of a process than I expected. My mom got very sick when I was in grad school at Southern Illinois University. She had cancer. Unfortunately, she did not survive in the end. But I went back to Chicago to kind of take care of and be with her. Now, so I did my first 4 years pretty smoothly. And when you're going for a PhD, you have a couple of years of classwork. And then you're expected to do some teaching, send in some articles, but you start writing your graduate dissertation. So I got to the start of that process, and then this health problem arose. And I ended up going back to Chicago. And that's when I got a lot of the other stuff that's in the sort of half-joking Twitter tagline. So I was one of those bullpen guys on LaSalle Street for a while, which was an interesting job. I worked for Marcus Evans, the large, aggressive British company. My focus wasn't on sort of the classic securities trading, but the focus of their business model is tracking down CEOs and getting them to meet one-on-one with other CEOs to push product. The model works well enough, but the entire job is based around signing six-figure contracts with these CEOs to do X. So you have to use a variety of, innovative techniques to get their cell phone, find their home address, find, their personal desk at their office, so on. So a lot of screaming into phones, a lot of guys in suits, a lot of people taking suspiciously long trips to the bathroom. But so I did that for a bit. Actually, I did that for a couple of years. The Freedom Rider job, quote unquote, will also happen during that period, and actually happened before I worked for Evans. As you probably know, there are large canvas organizations in every city. To some extent, they're the kids that are like, hey, got a minute for the environment or whatever, if you're walking around. Yeah. But the people doing that aren't volunteers. They're hired by third-party organizations. Mine was, let's say, the Fund for the People's Interest, but to go do this for a period of time. And they're sent throughout the neighborhoods of giant cities. When I was there, and actually in something of a leadership role there, they're sent on the road. They go to other communities and try to raise money, sign up voters for these causes. So the Freedom Rider label is a third in jest. But I worked for this group on a campaign for the Human Rights Campaign, which is obviously a gay and gender rights group, for, again, 2 or 3 years. Like, our office was based on the south side of Chicago. We canvassed through the winter. We sent people into some pretty hostile regions to raise awareness for this. And that was a fun job. There's a lot of hostile engagement with strangers. Do I have a minute for what? If you go to, say, Birmingham or something like this, a lot of office romances, quote unquote. But I went from there to the sales and trading floor environment. I wrote the dissertation, which ended up becoming a book. And again, just lived this sort of very urban life. I lived in Chicago at one point. I had an apartment in the tallest building in Aurora, which is like 30 stories tall. But, I did all this for a period of 5 or 6 years after the first 4 years of just coursework. And at the end of that, unfortunately, mom passed away. I got the degree. I closed the degree in 2015. So it took a lot longer than I expected. I went into grad school in 2005. But with that in hand, again, things went back to normalcy after the 2 to 3 years of street activism and 2 to 3 years of, working in a bullpen in a suit and all the sort of antics. At one point, I owned a small business devoted to nightlife with my good buddy Ozzy. So, we were throwing these parties and small raves and so on throughout Chicago and Aurora as well, the surrounding community. But anywho, I got the degree and stuff got a lot more mundane. I applied on the job market. I was pretty good. I figured the dissertation would be publishable. I had a couple other publications while I was in graduate school. And generally, you're going to go to a school that's on par with or one step down from the school you matriculated out of, where you got your degree, unless you're an earth-shattering genius. Whether that's me is up to others to judge. But I expected I was going to take pretty much the typical path. So I got, most of the offer letters were from, or most of the interview requests were from, one was from Sam Houston State, as I recall, University of Wisconsin Parkside, Kentucky State. And Kentucky State struck me as interesting because it's a historically Black school, but it's located in Appalachia, or right near the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. So in both those communities, I thought there'd be an actual chance to do some good and teach kids and so on. I could have stayed in the sort of financial sector really as long as I wanted. I wasn't standing around the street fighting with people at that point, but decided that I did want to use the PhD. So I went down to Frankfort, Kentucky. And, that's the end of sort of this long rambling intro story there. But that's where I am right now. Actually, I live, I have an apartment in Louisville. I have a house or half of a building in Frankfurt. And I live here now.
Yeah. I know today a lot of what we're going to be talking about are taboos, and some of the topics related to the taboos that I think we probably both agree on related to American taboos are related to race.
Yeah.
Was that always an interest for you? I'd be curious to know, before we get into the book, when you began to visualize in your head that this was something that maybe you were hitting on that would be an interest for you that you might want to pursue and eventually write a book about. When did that start to dawn on you as a subject of interest?
So that's actually a really interesting question. When I grew up, class was a lot more important to me than race, actually. Yeah. So a lot of these areas, I mean, if you're talking about the south side of Chicago, that's a heavily Black area, but you also have regions like the Bridgeport neighborhood or Canaryville, aka Cloverland, that are very heavily Irish American, Italian American. You have one of the country's largest Chinatowns down there. The unifier is really that everyone's kind of poor or working class.
Yeah.
I mean, the average guy in Chinatown is, without stereotyping, an immigrant from China. I mean, so if you go there, if you travel around to play basketball, get some good Chinese or Italian food or something, you see a lot of different colors of poor, striving people, kind of. So that was that environment. I didn't live in the hyper ghetto, which in Chicago you'd associate more with the west side of the city. But no one really had any money. And as I said pretty openly, I left Chicago as a young man. I moved to East Aurora, and that was even more of the same experience. I mean, that's a very Latino neighborhood. East Aurora, I would say when I was there, was about 50% Hispanic. It's a little more than that now, but you also had some African Americans. You had a lot of poor whites. I mean, you had people from Eastern Europe, so on down the line. Shout out to my buddy Ram Suleimani. I mean, who had that background, but a number of people from the former Yugoslavia, Bosnian refugees in that period in the late 90s are coming over. Obviously, terrible war over there. So again, like everyone was sort of different colors, but everyone was broke. And that was to me was the significance point. Like if we went on dates with our high school girlfriends, and we're personable enough as a group of guys. But if you went to surrounding cities like Naperville, Illinois, is a place that comes to mind, you would realize that other people had dramatically more money than you did.
Yeah.
And that to me, like when I went to college, part of my motivation was to get educated. But I think also for most working class kids that do that, there's that idea of I'm going to get a better job that doesn't involve working with my hands by going up through the social class process. And I remember before I went, my mom showing me specifically how to wear a tie. She herself had a pretty upper middle class background. She just, again, wanted to help kids and was bored with conventional office jobs. But I mean, wear a square faced watch, all that kind of crap, that was the primary divider between people that I noticed as I went from East Aurora to places we would go to socialize to a university campus. And actually, interestingly enough, the race thing, one of the reasons I said that I'm kind of glad to have had a normal American background. Like I grew up in a working class immigrant community in the heartland. I think I avoided a lot of and Sol says this as well, by the way. So does Charles Murray, for that matter. I mean, most people that didn't take that conventional, like Andover to Yale path, generally find it a positive thing. They learned how to endure troubling times better than they otherwise would have. But they also got perhaps the traditional American view on education, immigration, so on down the line. So I guess the point I'm making is a lot of the race stuff really hit me when I got to college.
Yeah.
That was the first time I started hearing about quote unquote wokeness. Oh, another point, unless you were in the gang scene, which fortunately I wasn't, gangs tend to break down along racialized lines. So, I mean, at that time in Chicago, you still had the Gaylords, which were mostly a white gang, not a very well-named one, but tough guys. I mean, you had the Latin Kings, you guessed it, the Black Disciples. But unless you were in that scene in the late 90s, this sounds like a cliche, but people really just got along. Like everybody cheered for Jordan and Bird. I'm sure there was some racism, not at the same time, but I'm sure there was some racism in the background. Like if you brought a white girlfriend home, would your mom be a little angry for some of my buddies? I'm sure at least as much in reverse, probably. But in day-to-day life, in a scene like high school varsity athletics or the local theater troupe or something like that, in the North in 1996, race didn't strike me as a particularly big problem. You would notice occasional issues. Your white buddy might not be able to apply for the same scholarship that you did. Or in reverse, you might take 2 more job applications. I remember once it was 11 for me and 9 for a Caucasian buddy for you to get summer employment. But on a day-to-day level, there wasn't an enormous amount of ethnic conflict. And you were able to talk to people who had come from areas where there was. Like, again, one of my buddies was from Bosnia. Yeah. You know, there were people from the Chiapas region of Mexico. So the racial stuff as opposed to the class stuff, family problem stuff, because, again, this is the era where divorce, 50% of white and black families, marriages ended in divorce. So that you definitely saw feminism. You definitely saw the impact of hookup culture or divorce culture, all that. But race wasn't really that big of a deal. And the reason I'm doing that lead in is that when I got to college, all of a sudden there were all these sort of post-Marxist theories about how oppressed I was. And as a smart guy from a majority minority city, who, again, although this wasn't my primary definer, was an athlete, had a professional parent, which is not 100% in poorer regions, I had never thought of myself as oppressed at all. I thought of myself to some extent as advantaged. When I judge myself against other people, I would sort of look at material or intellectual qualifications. Do they have a car? That sort of thing. Sometimes even silly stuff. Could I beat them up? It would be none of the stuff that I confronted in college had I confronted on a regular basis in day-to-day life. But when you get there, obviously, American higher education leads extraordinarily far to the left. That's not a controversial comment. So I was exposed for the first time to sort of value of whiteness theory. White privilege was very sort of in at this time. I mean, the original papers, Cheryl Harris, Andrew Hacker had come out in the mid-90s. I was exposed to sort of critical theory in general. I mean, the many derivatives of Marxism. I took a couple sociology classes. I majored in political science. So I began to see that there were a lot of people focusing on race issues who genuinely perceived themselves as oppressed. But to me, it was a bit bizarre because all of these people struck me as very rich and comfortable. So that's kind of how that happened in college. Last sentence, really, but the desire to look at some of the claims that were being made, like the claim of white privilege, I think your question was a good one. That did, I suppose, begin on kind of the American university campus. It certainly, by the time grad school came around, I was curious about a lot of the claims that were being made. And so my dissertation actually looks at Andrew Hacker, very famously, Queen's University political scientist, asked a group of white kids how much money they'd have to be paid to be black. And leaving aside the pool, which is like Irish and Italian guys in Queens, I'm not sure about that one. But leaving aside the pool, the average answer was $50 million. And that is kind of the quantitative proof that still today is used to demonstrate the value of white skin privilege in this institutionally racist society, et cetera. And it struck me that it was very likely members of every group would say this. By my second year of grad school, I remember there was a day when we were playing basketball, and I actually asked a group that happened to be all upper middle class, Asian and black guys, how much they'd have to be paid to become white. And all these people are perfectly friendly toward Caucasians in many interracial relationships, but they started asking sort of the same joking questions that Hacker's subjects had in reverse, like, would I get dumber? I was probably an Asian guy. But I mean, like, would my fashion sense change? Would my scholarship continue to exist? Would I be a bad dancer? And everyone's just sort of screwing around. But you realize that minority people aren't generally less attached to, say, a black identity than white guys are to a white identity. The dissertation actually looks at this in some depth. I use kind of modern quantitative methods. And I ask people, if this were even possible, how much money, frankly, would you have to be paid to change your core characteristic identities, your race, sex, sexual orientation, religious faith tradition, so on down the line? There are a series of experiments known as list experiments that are run in the dissertation. And a long story short, what I find is that if you view this as a measure of racism at all, the most racist group in U.S. society is old Asian men. Black people in general attach more valuation to their identity than whites do. so on down the line. Like the initial claim, whether or not you think there's some slight advantage to being Caucasian on the job market, but the initial claim that white people value themselves, others don't, there's lower self-esteem among members of minority groups. I mean, I and others have empirically found just isn't true. So I think that definitely brought forward the question of how real are a lot of these claims. White fragility, for example, seems like a classic test case for this. Like if you confronted members of any group with the stereotypes about their ethnicity, would they not respond with anger or with a bit of nervousness, something like that? As far as I can tell, there's never been an empirical test of whether Blacks, for example, are any less fragile than whites are. Looking at modern discourse around, quote unquote, the N-word and so on, I tend to doubt it. But yeah, going from a functional multiracial community, which is what most working class exurbs are, to campus, where there was this constant focus on ethnic identification and feminism, and you had the, every distinct group student center, did kind of make me think these are new ideas, but I didn't think they were smart new ideas. I thought they were very stupid ones. So I started trying to test some of them. Yeah.
Yeah. And I want to get into that. I want to get into the tests that you've done and the data that you've obtained from those tests. I'm going to read a quote from your book, Taboo, 10 Facts You Can't Talk About. I thought this was a very good introduction to what a taboo is in general. The quote is, tackling taboos is difficult but necessary. Very often, most often, they are used not to shield strong and valid ideas from pointless attacks, but rather to protect weak ones from worthwhile criticism. The censor tends not to be an individual fully confident he is right, but rather one who is terrified to the core that he is wrong. Only by ignoring the censor's taboos and beginning to speak can we challenge bad ideas, overcome them, and replace them with better ones. Let's keep talking. Let's start talking. So the name of this show is Keep Talking. And I'd love to transition from that quote to ask you, and I should preface this by saying that I know in doing research about your work that you've already alluded to this, you attempt to apply empirical, rigorous testing to claims like the subjects that you have brought up so far. Maybe we can start this section of the conversation by having you talk about what you have found in general that might surprise people related to what the data seems to indicate related to subjects that you think actually matter to our society.
Okay, yeah. So I think starting with a broad lens, a lot of work coming out of the contemporary softer sciences, and certainly the humanities and the grievance studies sector as well, is pretty questionable. You, in my opinion, should be pretty skeptical of it because of the extraordinary concentration of political bias in that world. So I posted a graphic to Twitter the other day that was breaking down each of the major academic fields by the percentage of liberals and conservatives in the field. And in sociology, the percentage breakdown was something like 79% identified Democrats, 0% identified Republicans. Now you had a barrier group of independents who identified as anything from libertarians to Marxists, if I recall correctly. But that's still pretty remarkable. Like the number of openly Republican, if you use that as a proxy for conservative sociologists, was 0. So I think, and you can get into some other things, like what are the qualifying GRE scores for each field when we're talking about the studies and so on. But I think there's an entire body of work that comes out, often done by very smart people, but that comes out of a sector that leans virtually 100% along one axis of the political compass. And that's extremely bizarre. And without kind of straw manning or whatabouting, I mean, you do have to ask the question of how would people on the political left treat social science if the primary fields, say political science, leaned 98-2 in the direction of the hard right, and people kept producing non-replicable studies about how women love being housewives and international wars are almost always justified and so on down the line. And I think the obvious response is people would treat this as a bit of a joke. I'm not quite at that point with all of it, but I definitely think a lot of rigorous testing of the claims that are out there is needed. So I'll give some examples, actually. This is one of the things that I've tried to do. One of my fields in college, at least to the point of going through 4 or 5 classes on it, was methodology, which at Southern Illinois is the 500 A through C sequence. I also took qualitative methods. I don't know if that's actually on the degree, but it's always been an interest of mine. So I'm using those basic techniques. I mean, linear regression, logistic regression, more advanced regression methodologies, even sometimes simple cross tabulations, and basic knowledge of experimental design to examine some of the things that are very frequently said. And this can range from the very simple, like one example, one of the first pieces I wrote for a major public intellectual journal or outlet came out in Quillet. And I looked at the question of whether there's an epidemic of transgender murders. This is a claim that's made constantly by groups like my old employer, actually, the Human Rights Campaign. There's a transgender day of silence and remembrance and so on. And I don't really have any problem with that, but I wasn't seeing that there's an extraordinary amount of supplementary evidence here. So I looked, and even I was surprised. I mean, the HRC and other groups post data publicly of all of the known trans murders on an annual basis. And when I looked, it turned out that in a typical year, there are maybe 32 of those. So I simply compared the murder rate for biological males who identify as trans, aka trans women, to a number of other groups, African Americans, lower income whites, so on down the line, men, like all men as a block. And what I found is that the trans female, if you want to use that term, murder rate is lower than any of those. So I was able to break down what the actual trans murder rate was, given standard estimates of the trans population and so on down the line, and say, well, this really doesn't seem to be a problem. I mean, beyond the level that you don't want anyone to die. The transgender murder rate seemed to be far more on par with the murder rate for women overall than for men overall, despite the fact that all trans women are male. So, I mean, that was a piece that attracted a lot of attention, fair amount of backlash, but no one, I think the point is that no one could really challenge the core numbers that are at work. I mean, if this is an itemized listing of every one of the murder cases and the murder rate that comes from matching that up against the transgender population is X, well, you know, the facts are as they are. But that's something that's happened that I've done a number of times, actually. I mean, I also looked at the Stop Asian Hate movement. Myself and legendary research associate Jane Lingle compiled a list of probably the 100, I think it was 136 of these cases that had really reached prominence, that had made it into mainstream national media, and kind of broke them down by perpetrator characteristics. So ethnicity, mental illness, known or not, so on down the line. And the presentation of the Stop Asian Hate movement initially was very much, we have white people, possibly white supremacists, attacking Asian Americans. What we found was dramatically different. More than 50% of the perps were Black. The rest were mostly white, but crazy. You had a lot of homeless people, a lot of people who probably should have been incarcerated, institutionalized. So, I mean, the piece goes into mental patient deinstitutionalization, some other things. But again, the basic test is, was this sort of white supremacy? No. And I've ranged pretty far afield with this kind of stuff. I looked at whether COVID lockdowns work for a British magazine. At one point, there were 7 U.S. states in 2020 that opted never to lock down. So across a bunch of metrics, and the regression models in this one are pretty solid, actually. I mean, including simple, but pretty solid, but including, you know, population density and variables like this. Is there any evidence that lockdowns work better than basic NPI, like protecting seniors? And the answer was no. There were fewer deaths per capita in, if I recall correctly, every one of the non-lockdown states. The highest death per capita DPC states until quite recently were New York and New Jersey, which locked down pretty frantically for much of 2020, but which also didn't protect seniors at all. The average COVID victim was 81, and we're at one point doing things like shipping sick seniors back into nursing homes. So again, you have the sort of starting popular idea, which is just one life. We need to do anything possible to protect the vulnerable. But you didn't have a lot of examinations outside of a couple of medical journals by that point of whether the techniques that were being used actually did anything significant, had any statistically significant effect. So I've done this across a bunch of different issue areas, I think, competently. But the focus is very much the claims that are made by modern, softer academia, or by people that are kind of on the fringes of that. Ibram Kendi, I suppose, is still an academic, but does, as I do, a great deal of popular writing, but that have a lot of influence on kind of upper brow thought in the USA. So a lot of this is focused on kind of white privilege, systemic racism, the claims of Black Lives Matter, so on down the line. So the dissertation that I described to you includes my test to some extent of the classic white privilege hypothesis. Do whites value their identities more? Are they more reluctant to change them, so on down the line? I find very little support for that. But the book Taboo, I think, which is the most recent book I've written, sort of takes this idea into all of the fields we've described. It's not as quantitative as an individual article, but I mean, like chapter 1 is the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yeah.
You know, are the claims that were frequently made about thousands or tens of thousands of unarmed Black people being killed by the police? And I mean, I can give you examples of this. And Ben Crump has a book out, Open Season, The Legalized Genocide of Colored People. Were those real and valid? And again, that was just basically looking through police shooting statistics, vetting the Washington Post database for accuracy, that kind of thing. But the total number of unarmed Black men shot by police in a typical year seems to be between 10 and 20. Last year was 18, and everyone agrees on that, from Heather McDonald to the WAPO. That's the consensus figure. So,
to focus on that specifically, and that was an issue that I know you have gotten a lot of attention for, but to highlight that fact, and I think this ties into many of the other subjects you've already spoken about. You know, let's give that fact its prominence and its accuracy. I don't think most people in this country would come close to that number in terms, if they were asked what they think that number probably is. I think they might be off by an order of magnitude or more. You know, I love the question, cui bono, who benefits, right? If this does tend to be, if this is a taboo, if this is something that's basically shielding people from the accurate truth of the matter, it then bears the question to me, why is that fact not more widely known? Who is benefiting from concealing that fact from the general public? You know, you've done a lot of research on that subject specifically, you know, and this week I kept coming back to this idea that when I was a kid, there was a tagline that was often used, which is that sex sells. And it's, I think, also fair to say that fear also sells. You know, another quote that I love about the media is that the goal of the media is to make every problem your problem. But I think in this specific case, the goal of much of the media is to amplify a problem in a way that is a bit deceptive or very deceptive. I'm sure you've thought a lot about this, but for you, how do you answer that question of who is benefiting from concealing that fact from the public and amplifying, you know, racial tensions in America? Is it literally as simple of the fact that so much of the media is reliant on advertising? It's a business and controversy sells. How do you think about that subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. That media quote is worth repeating. I mean, the goal of the media is to make every problem your problem. And I would add a sentence, to sell product. I mean, like a lot of people forget this. The media is just an ad delivery vehicle.
Yeah.
I'm good friends with a couple of people, mostly on the right, but by no means entirely, that work in television. And they're pretty open about this. I mean, if you ever do an interview with live, really, it's Fox, but I assume CNN, MSNBC, so on are the same. There's a very hard break before each commercial. Like, you'll hear words in your ear, like, we got to get you done. You'll say your piece, and then the ad for Toyota Tundras will come on. So I would assume that across the ideological spectrum, there's definitely a desire to run the content that generates the most clicks. Yeah. So the goal is to make every problem your problem, is to get you almost panicked and wired into the screen. And that's because that's what sells advertising in an environment where you're moving commercials for, $500,000 per hit.
Yeah.
So I think that in terms of the broader, and I'll get into some other people that might benefit, but in terms of what you just said, the average person would get the figures for police shooting and especially police killings of blacks wildly wrong. That's not a hypothetical. I mean, the Skeptic Research Center recently did a well-done large-in survey where they asked people how many unarmed black men they thought were killed annually just each year by cops. And the average answer from people that identify as leftist or liberal was around 10,000. And it's worth expanding that a little bit. They didn't all say 10,000, but it was for very liberal. I think it was 30 to 40% of them said it was about 1,000 or more than 1,000. Then another 14 to 15% said that it was about 10,000. And then 8% said that it was more than that, like more than 10,000 people annually, black people annually, were murdered while unarmed by the police. And it's worth putting that in context. I mean, 2020 and 2021 have seen near record highs for murders, at least in the recent past. And there's still only about 20,000 murders per year. And black people are overrepresented, but we only commit maybe half of them. So the number of people that these guys thought were killed by cops annually while black is larger than the number in many cases of black murders total that there are in a year. So when you say it's overestimation by an order of magnitude or more, that's literally correct in the sense of 10 to 1 or square up 100 to 1. You're talking about 18 unarmed black men that are killed by police, not 10,000. So that's an incredible discrepancy. By the way, when we look at regular media consumers, though, we find these sort of discrepancies all the time. I mean, Kex TC, the large consulting firm, recently found, and this is back in 2021, I believe, this is 2022 now, but they recently found that the average American believes that 9% of the population has died of COVID. So that's the typical figure. People act as though they're being reasonable. They'll say, well, I don't think it's 20%, I don't think it's 30%, it's 8%. I mean, now COVID-19, terrible scourge, took about 400,000 people last year, but there are 350 million Americans. That's roughly 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 900. If 9% of the population or 10% of the population was dead, that would be around 32 million people.
Yeah.
I mean, there'd be coffins lining the streets. We wouldn't be able to bury that many people in the cemetery land we have available. So people that are constantly exposed to the media, as read the most random topics from killer bees to child kidnapping, tend to be very, very afraid. We've known this since Glassner, a left-wing but very skilled sociologist, pointed out in 1999, the culture of fear. So who benefits from all this goddamn terror? I think that you're saying, well, the media companies obviously benefit from it. Yeah, sure. I think that's probably half the answer. The other thing people forget, though, is often it's just Grant buried in Grant's tomb. I mean, who benefits from this constant panicking around race relations and so on? The groups that are designed to initiate panic around race relations. I mean, so we sometimes forget how large the grievance industrial sector is. I mean, there's some groups that are loosely affiliated with this sector, like 100 Black Men, that do great work. But a lot of them are just sort of on bullshit since the 1960s ended. I can't think of a positive thing, really, Reverend Al or Brother Jesse, or Sean King, for that matter, has done for the Black community. And the figures go significantly beyond Reverend Al's 1990s budget at this point. I mean, Black Lives Matter received $11 billion. If you look at the primary organizations like BLM, GNF, over the past couple of years. That's a famous Economist article from last July. So who benefits from this? The people that received $11 billion benefit. I mean, I would assume the ACLU, SPLC, the national BLM chapters, very powerful players work together to coordinate the flow of this information into mass media. So the kind of structural model isn't necessarily all that complicated.
Yeah, I should concede that, I grew up revering the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I think many of these organizations, same with the ACLU, they have done such amazing work historically. I think your point is that in modern times that they're often off base with their assessment of the state of things. I want to read you a quote from the book, The Madness of Crowds. I'm guessing you're familiar with this idea, the St. George and retirement syndrome. But this is a direct quote from Douglas Murray's book. St. George and retirement syndrome. After slaying the dragon, the brave warrior finds himself stalking the land, looking for still more glorious fights. He needs his dragons. Eventually, after tiring himself out in pursuit of ever smaller dragons, he may eventually even be found swinging his sword at thin air, imagining it to contain dragons. If that is a temptation for an actual St. George, imagine what a person might do who is no saint, owns no horse or lance, and is being noticed by nobody. How might they try to persuade people that, given the historic chance, they too would without question have slain the dragon? Our public life is now dense with people desperate to man the barricades long after the revolution is over, either because they mistake the barricades for home or because they have no home to go to. In each case, a demonstration of virtue demands an overstating of the problem, which then causes an amplification of the problem. You know, I love that quote, and I think that's an important idea to keep in mind. And in many ways, I resonate with the impulse of the activists who might be experiencing the St. George in retirement syndrome, because there is, I think, a human impulse to want to be on the side of the angels and to fight against injustice, to fight for justice in a society. I think your point in your research, and I think this is what makes your research so interesting, is that it does try to be objective and empirical and scientific in assessing actual reality. And my concern is that these taboos are, as I said in the quote from your book earlier, it's concealing the truth. It's actually a move made by someone who is not particularly confident in their assessment of reality. And I have just personally, in my own evolution, had to, I considered myself the leftist when I was in college and even shortly after college. And it has taken a long time, I think, to just have reality collide with a lot of my conceptions of the way things are in America. And so I empathize with people who have an impulse to be an activist, but I think, taboos are often an affront to truth. And they're propping up lies in a society. Something else that I wanted to say to you related to this whole subject, and I talked to John McWhorter a couple months ago, which was an enormous honor for me. And I don't know if you know John, but I know you know of each other, and that you guys have connected in some ways online. One thing that I wanted to say to him that I didn't get a chance to say, which was I had talked to him during the conversation about the fact that, my mom is a teacher as well. And when we were growing up in the heartland in the Midwest, as kids, we would watch Martin Luther King speeches, and it was such an emotional and beautiful vision of what America could be and could become. And I just look around now at some of the attempts to now separate children on racial lines, to implant ideas in kids' heads who were young that there is an oppressor and oppressed group of people from immutable characteristics. And I just see that, separate from any political leanings I have, as an utter betrayal of the Martin Luther King vision for the country. I'd love for you to speak to that if you can. You've already alluded to the critical race theory issue in this conversation, but what do you make of that? It seems like in your conversation today and in other conversations I've heard you mention this before, that a lot of this is rooted in academia. And I'm wondering if you think these social scientists who are the high priests in our society, in universities, do you think that they are experiencing this St. George in retirement syndrome? How do you assess their insistence on things being so bad? It dawned on me too that progressives seem to have a hard time admitting progress. What do you think is at root for those professors, the intellectuals of our society on campus that are trying to propagate these ideas in society, and in many ways are successful in doing so? What do you think is at root of why they are so insistent on that?
Yeah, I think St. George and retirement syndrome, that famous old description, Don Quixote syndrome, you're trying to be a knight years after the era of the knights errant ended. I mean, I think that's a pretty accurate description. So the underlying baseline fact here is that the civil rights movement was a smashing victory now close to a century ago, if you're talking about the first components of that. I mean, I'm from the northern, and obviously we'll get into Brown versus Board, but I mean, I'm from the northern portion of the United States, and my high school, I think, in fact, I know, has been integrated since the 1930s. So, I mean, that obviously racial conflict by that point wasn't over in the USA. But Brown versus Board, I mean, mandated desegregation, at least technically, even in the South, took place in 1954. The Civil Rights Act, making racism civilly and in some cases criminally illegal, or let's say racial discrimination, that was 1964. And I mean, the entire process, the end game of the first round of the civil rights movement, I mean, the assassinations of Kennedy, King, all of this took place 50, 60 odd years ago. The one example that I use here is we've had pro-minority affirmative action in the United States at a large scale since the Philadelphia Plan in 1967. Now, again, no serious person thinks that the existence of pro-minority affirmative action means racism doesn't exist or something like that. But the primary victory, so 1967, it's 2022. And it's the 55 years ago was the initiation of affirmative action, not of desegregation. Again, ethnic conflict has not ended. Ethnic conflict, like the poor, will be ever with us, probably. But this is something that when I was growing up wasn't really disputed outside of, again, a few academic debating salons. I saw it a little bit when I got to, say, the University of Illinois. Even there it was muted. But the idea at this time seemed to pretty much be that the civil rights conflicts of the past were in the past. And what remained to ensure equality was enforce the Civil Rights Act, perhaps allow some private sector affirmative action and let people move forward. Reparations was a fringe idea at the time, so on down the line. And I guess I still think this is correct. I don't describe myself as radically conservative. I mean, when Bill Clinton was in office, I was a Bill Clinton Democrat. Like most urban Black and Irish and Italian guys who just gotten old enough to vote. And in many ways, I'm still a Bill Clinton Democrat. So I don't think that what we've seen is the ordinary American sort of working man, or for that matter, center-right business person, which is what I was prior to academia, really moving dramatically to the right of the spectrum. I think we've seen the center of intellectual energy in the country shifting left away from them. That's obviously what's happening. That's been tracked by some of the better papers in political science. So the first point the civil rights movement won is just inescapable. I think what you're describing is a downstream result of that to some extent.
Yes.
So the would-be St. George's no longer have the old dragons to slay. What about Southern segregation? Well, that's been over for 65 years. Okay, well, what about the legality of racism? There hasn't been any such thing for 58 years. Could we get some system into place that will actually advantage minorities to make up for the past, a kind of quasi-reparations? Well, if you look at affirmative action or even poverty policy, that's been in place for 50 years. So I think what you see a lot of on the progressive left is, frankly, the redefinition of terms to create new enemies to fight. That is entirely the sort of Ken DeAngelis take on racism, for example. The argument now is that any system that produces disparate outcomes among groups, like intelligence testing, must be racist because the only options in terms of that gap are genetic inferiority, which no one wants to admit and which isn't real, or racism. The reality, of course, is that that's just complete BS. One group could study slightly more for the test. Asians kick both white and Black Americans' asses. Even moving away from things like that, which at least imply some cultural gap, although cultural gaps exist all the time and they are not controversial, there are many other variables. I mean, if you're talking about income or crime rate, it's relevant that the average Black guy is a decade younger than the average white guy. I mean, if you want to move that to the modal average, the most common age for whites is 58. Most common age for Blacks is 27. So whether you're talking about wealth on the left or crime on the right, you're being completely disingenuous if you don't point out that the Black guy is 31 years younger than the white guy. I mean, so all of this, these arguments are incredibly weak, the ones that are coming from the current prog left, in my opinion. But the reason they're weak is that there's still the desire to slay the dragon, but the dragon isn't what it used to be. You're out there hunting wyverns. And I personally think that there are probably better things to do with your time than hunting wyverns. But
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the really last sentence here, I think that the institutional structure that we've both agreed on is a problem here. So, I mean, it's easy to make these comments and toss out a few jokes and say, well, why don't they just go do something else? There's still probably some women's rights issues out there. The reason it's not that simple is that the organizations, the ACLU, the SPLC, which we both used to admire, exist. They're not going to tear down their building, that fortified SPLC center, those lawyers that focus on race, and go do something else, help out the developing world or some such. So we have to find a way to get past these redefinitions of non-problems into problems. And that's the tough issue from a leadership perspective.
I agree with you. And I think my worry is that these institutions and these professors, they still have such power where a lot of the ideas in the culture, if you think of ideas like fashion, they can't, separating the truthfulness, the veracity of the statements that are coming out of academia. It is just fashionable, I think, for large numbers of people. I certainly identify this, who are in college, to agree with their college professors and to continue to revere institutions like the ones that you have spoken about in this conversation because their parents did. And why I think it matters is because if they are incorrect about assessing reality and they continue to have, you used this word earlier, they use their massive amount of energy and resources to fight a non-problem and to create hysteria, it has the possibility of destabilizing a society. I want to talk a little bit about a video that you made related to the 1619 Project, which is something that I know we emailed a little bit about, and the video has gotten a lot of attention. I want to run through the primary points that you make in it, and then allow you to speak to it. And I in my mind, this is another one of those ideas in our culture that has become very fashionable to agree with. And I think very few people have really thought through what the primary foundation is of the 1619 Project. So I'm going to tick through the primary points you make in the video. You obviously can correct me after I'm done. And then I want to get your thoughts on it. So to summarize the 1619 Project, and just to give some background, it was published by the New York Times in 2019, won a Pulitzer Prize in 2020 for commentary. The primary claims is that the U.S. was founded really in 1619 when the first slave came to America, and that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the Declaration of Independence, was essentially a smokescreen to protect the founders' slave holdings, and that racism is not a part of the American experience. It is the American experience at root in the country. And then you tick off the three primary claims of the 1619 Project. The first being the preservation of slavery was the real cause for the American Revolution. You point out the fact that the founders' reasons for revolution were taxation without representation, conflicts over debts from the French and Indian War, the Stamp Act. The most important reason was the desire to set our own path as a country, as a sovereign nation. You also make the point that slavery wasn't under threat from the British, and that Britain didn't free its own slave in its own colonies until 1833, which was 57 years after the Declaration of Independence. You said that slavery was hotly debated at the Constitutional Convention, but that was after the War of Independence had already been won. The second point you make is that slavery made America rich. This is a claim by the 1619 Project that the slavery made America rich. Your point was that slavery did make some Americans rich, and you note that Eli Yale was one of those people, but that it actually hindered the American economic development in the South. And that in 1860, just before the Civil War, 90% of the skilled, well-paid laborers in America were in the North, including the vast majority of its factories. The cost of abolishing slavery was enormous. 360,000 Union soldiers died to free 4 million slaves. And that our GDP has grown 12,000% since abolishing slavery. The third primary point of the 1619 Project: racism is an unchangeable part of America. It claims that we're an inherently racist country that can't overcome its flaws. You point out that we're the most successful multiracial country in history, the only white majority nation to ever elect a black president twice. You concede that there have been major setbacks, but you also think it's crucial to note that the major progress we've made within the last 400 years, 100 years, 50 years, 2 million Black African legal immigrants have come to America in the past 50 years alone and have become one of the most successful groups in the country. Why would these people move to an evil, racist country? Furthermore, a vast majority of whites have also advanced the cause of racial equality. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed by the U.S. Senate, which had, out of 100, 98 white senators. That video, in my exposure to the 1619 Project, was the best, most concise takedown of its primary claims. And I think for a lot of Americans who love this country and admit its flaws, but are steeped in history, the assault on the foundation of the country and what, despite its warts and all, what it has stood for in the world, the 1619 Project in many ways is an assault on that idea. I want to give you an opportunity to add anything that I left out there, but I think for me, why this matters, in addition to it being, I think, factually wrong about what America really is, it is also attacking the nucleus of what America stands for in its population and its citizenry. And that is playing with fire, especially when the people who are writing that have such cultural influence. I want to just set the table for you to respond to that in any way that you would like, but I would encourage anyone who hasn't seen that video to watch it. I'll include that in the description below the YouTube video. How would you respond to that? Is there anything I missed that you would add?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, so first of all, I think that's a good summary of the video, which came out with PragerU about a year ago. Obviously, right-leaning organization. I lean at least to the center-right myself, but the video is pretty factual. It's just a breakdown of the errors in the 1619 narrative. And again, the 1619 Project made extraordinarily sweeping claims, which I think you did a good job of summing up. So at the specific level, I mean, the 1619 Project claimed that the motivating reason, the primary reason is their language for the American Revolutionary War was the preservation of slavery. They argued that slavery is the thing, I think was the language that made America wealthy, created great fortunes for men north and south is the language. They argue that racism is in the blood of the United States. It's this sort of heritable primary quality of the country. They argue that almost everything that made America truly unique, this is marketing materials now being dead honest, I don't know if this is in an essay, but came out of slavery. And it struck me looking at this that a lot of these claims are just facially nonsensical. I mean, slavery made many slave masters rich to take the most defensible of them, but we lost. I mean, 1 in 4 Southern men was wounded or killed during the Civil War. I mean, the Civil War moved America's debt from virtually nothing into what would be hundreds of billions of dollars today. To argue that sort of slavery uncomplicatedly made the USA wealthy, the South was a backwater throughout the era of slavery. That's something that I don't think any competent historian would just sort of so aggressively argue. I really haven't heard that claim. And this is why the 1619 Project, I think, was taken down so aggressively by people ranging from sort of, the OG Phil Magnus over to the World Socialist website. But that was the most defensible of the claims. I mean, everything unique about the country came out of slavery seems facially wrong. I mean, the example I give in a recent National Review piece is Indian immigration. Pre-existing Native American societies, that's just something that I don't think anyone could support. The Revolutionary War claim, I mean, Britain didn't free the slaves. So there's a technical debater's point here. Britain discussed freeing the slaves in Britain pretty early on. But Britain didn't free the slaves in their overseas oceanic colonies until 1833. I mean, by which point we banned the slave trade in 1808, fought the Civil War in 1861. So that's kind of between those two dates. But it's a long time after 1776. So you kept finding these mistakes. I don't just want to pile on one piece of academic work. I mean, the 1619 Project's fact checker wrote a fascinating article for, I believe, The Atlantic, just talking about what she had told them to take out of the project. Well-respected Black historian, and how she was essentially ignored. I think that this is, by the way, this is the general problem with the quote unquote CRT debate. what parents are being told, like what people active in the moms movement, for example, are being told is, look, you guys aren't experts. We're just trying to teach history. And if you're not familiar with the political power games being played, that's actually pretty convincing. Who can object to the teaching of history? But the reality is that what 1619 or the Howard Zinn curriculum or some such does is not present history honestly. It's presented an extremely slanted, far left view on history that includes mistakes like those I just mentioned. No one objects to teaching slavery, honestly. So those are the problems with 1619, or the false claims, in my opinion. That's the issue with CRT more broadly. And I think we can discuss the horrors of slavery, but also put them in rational context. When slavery existed in the USA, slavery existed around the world. It existed globally. The civilized Arab and Black states in North Africa conducted a slave trade in whites. This is known as the Barbary slave trade. A larger slave trade in Black Africans, the Arabic slave trade, involved no whites in our contemporary sense. That involved the Black kingdoms selling slaves to Arab traders, sometimes raiders. Those individuals went to the Middle East. And in the USA, as a Black man, I would obviously say slavery contributed to the early U.S. economy. But slaves, I mean, you're talking about perhaps 15% of the national population concentrated in our poorest region, producing about equivalently. So you can actually look at what percentage of GDP those slave-made goods made up. I would assume about a proportional amount. I've never seen an estimate over 50%, even before you get into, for example, purchasing power parity, before you get into the fact that the product of sort of white yeoman farms might not go into the GDP calculation. And then you have to look at what was the productivity of slavery as versus any other possible use of the same land, which could have saved the South from backwater status. What's the overall cost benefit once you work in the costs of the Civil War, which again killed 360,000 boys in blue, about 300,000 Confederates. And a final point, if you're talking about slavery as the thing that made America what it is today, the GDP of the United States has increased, as you said, about 12,000% since 1866. So are those funds, the money involved in Meta or something like that, do those trace back in any way to this unfortunate historical period 150 or 200 years ago? So all these are questions that any serious social scientist or any serious historian is going to have to ask. And I don't find that in these sort of pop public debates, they very often are asked. So I asked a few of them in a quick video that was my contribution to the pop public debate.
Yeah.
I
want to, I know we're getting towards the end of the conversation, and I want to talk about a couple more things with you. I think it's important when we have these conversations to also admit that the country is obviously far from perfect, and it still has its problems. And I would ask you that question. You're a data-driven individual. I think you're doing the best you can to try to understand the reality of modern America with facts and to speak those clearly. If you were president or you were just a citizen who wanted to propose, policies or cultural shifts that you think actually would have a chance of truly improving the country, what are those options, right? What are those possibilities for how we might be able to improve America in general?
I think that's a fascinating question. I have plenty of answers, actually. So first, I don't think that the kind of deep historical focuses of a lot of the current debate are useful at all. I don't think that contemporary racism really has much of anything to do with the performance of groups in the United States. There's definitely some effect of racism on lower level hiring. If you look at audit studies, I discussed my own experience with that. But I think the exact reverse would be true if you look at successful college applications or Fortune 500 job applications or something like that. And the reality is that of the 10 most successful groups in the USA, if you just go on Wikipedia or Britannica and look at a list of incomes, 8 are minority groups. Indians are in the number 1 spot. I believe 2 and 3 are still Taiwanese, Filipino. There's generally a Black group, South Africans or Nigerians, that cracks the top 10. then this is without Jews being included, by the way. I don't mean to be glib there, but I think there's some power players you could break out of that white group, Arabs that aren't generally considered white in practice. So today, when you look at figures like those, I simply don't think Nigerians actually are the best educated. I think South Africans are in the top 10 terms of income. But when you look at these sort of debates, I don't think there's much of an argument that an immigrant to the United States from a stable Black country, Jamaica, would have a dramatically different experience than an immigrant to the United States from a stable, similar income white country, Northern Ireland or Greece. So I don't think that this constant focus on sort of the white gaze or digging out the last remnants of racism, it feels like ornithology, that has nothing to do with the problems that we see in the USA. Problems like crime are, in fact, distributed across groups. I mean, there are problems in poor white communities. If you look at the opiate epidemic, there are problems in Black communities, problems in Latino communities. So I don't think a race lens there makes a great deal of sense at all. So what would I actually do? I think in general, there are pretty consistent policies that work across time in terms of improving societies. So I would say when I look at things the Republicans are doing better right now in the USA, they have a more coherent position on crime, fatherlessness, illegal immigration, welfare policy, non-CRT sort of traditional education until you get into creationism, that sort of thing. So I would pursue those policies. I mean, I would fund police departments as they traditionally have been funded. I would look at expanding funding or budgetary processes so that social workers and the like could work with these departments. But I certainly wouldn't replace police officers with those individuals. Basically, I'd have a lot of cops on the street and you'd see less crime. I would put incentives in place. Some of my male followers might not love this, but strict enforcement of the child support system, so on, that would encourage family stability. Mitt Romney, of all people, actually has a pretty good plan around this, where there'd be various tax benefits and credits if you do grow a family, if you stay and support your family, so on. So, family stability, crime, illegal immigration is something I have very little sympathy toward. I would seal the border. Obviously, it's politically incorrect to say this, but when people look at why the working man's wages have stagnated since 1973, we hear all these explanations about greedy corporate outsourcing, also something I would end as king or whatever I am in this scenario. But I mean, but one of the obvious factors, two of the obvious factors are mass illegal immigration and the feminist movement. We now have something like 55% more people competing for the same number of jobs. Obviously, we're not going to send women back home. So the obvious solution to that issue is to limit and regulate immigration and focus it on merit. Almost literally every "he just wanted a better life" argument you could make in the context of illegal immigration, you could also make in the context of your local weed man. I mean, you could say this about any nonviolent crime. So very little sympathy there. I'd have a coherent immigration policy focused on merit, a lot of tough cops in the street, support family stability, so on down the line. Real crackdowns on opiates entering the country, the production of opiates domestically. The large majority of people don't need to take heroin as a painkiller. Some potential sanctions against China in terms of that product from their country entering ours. Not too much race stuff. So I gave the Republican side. What are the Democrats better on? That's scientific research if you get them away from climate. Some of the broader social programs, healthcare, UBI. I'd be willing to consider either national healthcare or a UBI program or both, given the amount of tax money we take in. So I think that there are a lot of broad-based things from, anti-racist but hard and tough policing to UBI for poor people that would improve dramatically the life of the ordinary person. And I think it's hard to dispute that. I think it's hard to dispute that either effective anti-racist policing or a 30% boost to your income would make your life better. So that would be my focus. The racial stuff, I don't really think it's that much of an issue. I think people are making a non-problem an issue because they exist within an institutional structure focused on the non-problem. I would keep the Civil Rights Act in place. You occasionally have some radical conservative come along and say, get rid of it. People have the right to total free association. No, I think that would make it very difficult to drive from, say, Mississippi to Iowa as an interracial family and be served in every state.
Mm.
Private sector affirmative action, I don't have a massive problem with. We've solved this problem already, so I would move on to newer problems.
Yeah. A couple questions I want to sneak in before the end of the conversation.
Okay.
One I would love to ask you is, since the publication of your two most recent books, given that you are a data-driven individual, and I think this is an approach I try to take to beliefs that I have in being open to changing my mind as new information comes in, as new data comes in, as I'm exposed to new information that I was unaware of, that I'm becoming hopefully less ignorant over time. Is there anything in your book or even in life in general for yourself that in the last few years, whether before the book's publication or after, you have been exposed to new information, new ideas that has really altered the way you think about a subject that you previously had a very strong belief in? I would love to know that, if there is anything that comes to mind, because I do think that's such an important, human. Everybody wants to think we already have all of the answers, and none of us do, obviously. I tend to think that we are mostly ignorant about almost everything. Does anything come to mind for yourself that you have, you're an equal opportunity offender in some ways, and I think in the best sense of that word, because you are not afraid to speak your mind, which is what I have such an appreciation for people like that, and especially for yourself. Does anything come to mind for you where you did change your mind on something that did matter to you in the last few years?
Well, it would depend. I mean, there certainly are, in general, as an adult human being, when you get information that doesn't match a preset bias, but that is valid, replicable paper, latest issue of the journal you read, you should change your position. I think that there is a tendency to kind of wedge that sort of information aside on the part of many very smart people. That's a negative. I will say that because most of what I do, I mean, I've given the Black Lives Matter example, the interracial crime example, and some tertiary things, a dissertation I wrote in the past. I mean, the trans analysis paper, so on down the line, because so much of my writing is just anything from a public intellectual source to a book chapter, journal or conference submission, whatever, just looking at what the data is. I don't actually find that most of my positions have been wrong. That might sound a little glib, but if I were to look at the Washington Post police shooting database, and then the best known alternative a bit to the left, like Sam Singway's work, and then the best alternative a bit to the right, Fraternal Order of Police data or FBI data or something like that, and I were to find that there were 1,000 unarmed Black people killed every year by cops, I would change my mind after I vetted the data myself and called some people, did some research. But I haven't had that happen. I do think there are a few times when looking at academic fields I probably considered a bit soft, to sociology or Black studies, I've found a piece that's actually really good. And I've said, okay, well, this does change the perspective a little bit. An example on that would be the audit studies. I mean, there are a number of people that have looked at a Pager, for example, comes to mind, Gaddis, that have looked at how to measure racism in society and have designed these complex experiments where you provide lists of names associated with Black or white identity to employers, see who they hire. They're generally a little more likely to hire the white guy. But even there, I mean, my immediate response, I ended up writing an article for the journal Academic Questions about audit studies and how to design them after I read all those. Because I acknowledge, like, yes, there is an effect of racism here, but there are a lot of things that are never addressed, like the class problem, which everyone points out on the internet, but is hardly ever tackled in these articles themselves. So a typically Black name would be Jamarian, and a typical white name would be Tim. And I don't necessarily think that hiring Tim over Jamarian shows you're a racist. It strikes me the proper comparison is between Jamarian and Bubba. You know, like you need a class adjuster in there, which is almost impossible to do. One thing I suggested based on one previous paper by a guy named Derolia is that you use racialized last names, things like Black Man or Cortez that are obviously ethnic, and first names like John. And then compare that to like John McCullough, someone who has an ethnic white name that's as obviously Caucasian. Haven't seen that happen a lot. But anyway, even there, I think my reaction was, okay, I've learned something about this field. I can't dismiss these people as idiots, but I think there's some obvious checks coming from that heterodox space that I'd want to see them do. So that's a bit of an example, but very rarely have I advocated like a mainstream database sort of center right position and read a book by, say, Robin DiAngelo and thought, oh, I am a fool. I don't think that's the way that the direction that normally cuts, to be honest.
Yeah. The last question I want to ask you is, and maybe this is kind of two questions in one, but for people that are interested in the truth and they want to align their beliefs with reality as best they can, I would love to get your recommendations of people that you point to as being as impartial as possible, people who really do follow the evidence, that you would recommend for people to follow. And then the additional caveat to that I want to add is, just for you personally, I think we are mostly herd tribal animals, and a lot of our beliefs, I think this is why they map so closely onto the parts of the country where we were born, the families that we're in. We're more lawyers than scientists in my mind in terms of the way we think and the beliefs that we tend to hold. And it takes effort and some intentionality to break out of that and listen to other people that don't agree with you and to potentially change your mind. You have a rising public persona and a public presence, and you say things that, as a Black professor, I think really fly in the face of the traditional orthodoxy. What has that been like for you? Where do you get the kind of inner resolve to, continue to speak your mind in the face of all of what I would imagine are largely, incentives for you to kind of fall in line and to speak the good word of academia in general? I'd love to hear that story from your perspective as to how you've tried to maintain your independence of thought in that environment.
Well, I think that I'm a hip hop fan, and the rapper Tyler, the Creator, once did this famous tweet on why there's no such thing as cyberbullying. It was like, ha, 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 just turn the computer off, you weak mofo. And it's sort of the same thing. I think that part of the attitude that allows me to take something like a Twitter fight not too seriously, or a critique in a journal or something like that, is growing up in the hood. I thought I was going to go to what would have been the Iraq War. I had a lot of friends who did. Several of them died. I don't mean to say this in a bragging fashion, but between the Iraq War and the gang scene conflicts in Chicago at that time, I probably have 15 friends that have killed somebody. Yeah. Like, it's not that that's good, but I think that most people who came from a Black or Latino or Italian American, whatever neighborhood in that time frame, could say that same thing. So this whole idea of I am shocked by the level of content that I'm seeing on Instagram or something like that, I'm not really built like that. I don't have that reaction to it. And I think other than that, there aren't too many consequences. I'm not online making rape jokes. I'm not saying a lot of hardcore cancelable content. I'm just discussing the sciences from sort of this sarcastic, sort of cent-right perspective. So the backlash that I would get there would be significant only if I found that to be something to really worry about, which I don't.
Yeah.
So I think that's the answer. I also will note that teaching at a historically Black college in Kentucky, now academically, our rank is quite solid. We're number 6 among regional institutions in our area and so on. But in terms of the kind of culture, it's very different from what I'd be experiencing at sort of the Claremont colleges. So that's also important to remember. When we discuss a whole bunch of phenomena in the USA, including academia, there tends to be a sort of coastal, upper middle class, big city bias. And I think there are a lot of environments where it would be very difficult to at all diverge from the norm. But at most institutions, one of the A&Ms or the military schools, the community colleges, the Southern flagship schools, I'm not really sure that it would be very much different from where I am. Yeah. So I don't encounter a great deal of hostility. I'm obviously pretty pro-Black. I'm not a racist. And if I do, it's this sort of like someone with a Roman soldier profile pic AVIs yapping at me on Twitter. And I mean, I think the option there would be block the guy or turn off the computer. There's very little there that's actually going to challenge how your real life is lived.
Yeah. Yeah. And how about individual people that you recommend or you follow for other people in addition to yourself that you would recommend for independence of thought, courageous thinking, just smart individuals that you like?
Quite a few. I mean, so the roster, a good simple tip would be I'm an advisory board member of the groups FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism, and 1776 Unites. If you go to either website, 1776unites.com, or you Google Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism and click through, because we have a couple different sites. We have a diversity training portal and so on. But I mean, you'll find a board of advisors that goes from sort of Glenn Lowry to Steven Pinker to Megyn Kelly to Coleman Hughes. And I mean, I think every one of those people is someone that I would recommend in terms of, get the book, something like that. Another piece of advice also that I would recommend pretty strongly is just use primary sources. So, I mean, in terms of all this data that I've mentioned is widely available. I mean, the interracial crime data is in each BJS, Bureau of Justice Statistics report. Those come out once or twice a year. So, I mean, if you can just download that from the internet, which is what most research pros would do, you can skip the interpretation, whether that's from me or Rod Graham or Roland Fryer. You can just read what they said. So I recommend doing that, but I'd also recommend looking at the boards of those new kind of centrist database groups that are forming up.
Yeah. Wilfred, thank you so much for the time, man. I have a lot of respect for what you do. I've learned a lot from you. And more than anything, thank you just for the energy and the conversation today, man. It was a real pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Yeah, great talking to you too. Have a good one.
Thanks, buddy. Thank you, man. Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you're finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show via the links below on Venmo, PayPal, or Patreon. Your support helps to make these conversations possible.